Hi guys, hope you did well on your quiz. We're going to take notes on the rhombi and squares. Rhombi is plural for rhombus. Rhombus is a parallelogram with four congruent sides. That is the definition of rhombus. It also is like I said, a parallelogram. So it has all the properties of a parallelogram. Okay, so those first five that you memorized before, that is part of a rhombus. Also, rhombi have three more special properties. All sides are congruent, diagonals are perpendicular, diagonals bisect the angles. So pause and write those down. If parallelogram ABCD is a rhombus, then we can say, because we know all the sides are congruent, that side AB is congruent to side BC, is congruent to side CD, is congruent to side AD. Okay, diagonals are perpendicular. So in this case, if this was a rhombus, you would say diagonal BD, segment BD, is perpendicular to CA. Diagonals bisect the angles. So if this is a rhombus, you would say BD bisects angle ABC and ADC, and CA bisects angle BCD and BAD. Again, if you are unsure of what's happening there, you can always pause and rewind this video. Squares. Squares are all the properties of a rhombus, rectangle, and parallelogram. So if you remember your quadrilateral family tree, we had parallelograms here, and a parallelogram could be a rectangle or it could be a rhombus, right? And then we also wrote square on the bottom here, and it had arrows coming from both. That's because a square is a rectangle and a rhombus. So all squares are rectangles, all squares are rhombi. Not all rhombi are squares, not all rectangles are squares. All squares are parallelograms. So just a few, always, sometimes, nevers, just to kind of keep in mind. We're going to look at this algebra. I'm probably just going to do a couple of these, and then I'm going to let you work on those on your own. So we have to keep in mind the properties that we are talking about now. So, for example, we know ABCD is a rhombus. So if angle ABD, this angle right here, is 60 degrees, it wants me to find BDC. Well, all right, if this is a rhombus, that means that it must also be a parallelogram. And so if I know this angle right here, I can know this angle right here because it's a parallelogram, meaning these must be parallel. This is a transversal, meaning those are alternate interior. So angle BDC must be 60 degrees. Let's see, what other one might I want to do with you? Oh, one quick thing that I forgot to mention. You're going to need to know the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, anytime you see a right triangle, you probably already know this, but thought I'd throw it in there. Anytime you see a right triangle, you're going to label the legs A and B, doesn't matter which one. It does matter that you label the hypotenuse C, and A squared plus B squared equals C squared. This is useful because if you know one of the legs and a hypotenuse, or two of the legs, or any combination of two, you can always solve for the third. So that's going to be useful. So that would be useful in something like, for example, number 3. AB is 26 and BD is 20. Okay, well, if this is in fact a parallelogram, if BD is 20, because it's a parallelogram, the diagonals are bisected, meaning these are congruent, so this right here must be 10. Okay, if I'm looking at this triangle, then one thing I also know is that because it's a rhombus, then the diagonals are perpendicular, meaning they form right angles. So this right here is a right angle. So what we have, in fact, if I was just kind of turn this around, right, we have a right triangle with a leg of 10 and a hypotenuse of 26. So you would use the Pythagorean theorem to solve for this right here, which would give me AE, okay? I'm going to let you do that on your own, and I think I'm actually going to let you figure these out on your own. You can absolutely talk to the people around you. You can ask the substitute for help, but go ahead and work on that. Make sure that you remember that you might have to use properties of parallelograms as well as the new properties of rhombi, okay? Down here, this is kind of just like a little quick check. If we're talking about parallelograms, do the opposite slopes have to be equal? Well, if opposite slopes are equal, doesn't that mean that these are parallel, right? So are opposite sides parallel? Yes, in a parallelogram. And because a rectangle and a rhombus and a square are all parallelograms, then opposite slopes must be equal in all four. Perpendicular side slopes. Well, if the slopes of the sides are perpendicular, that means they form right angles, right? So the only shape that has for sure right angles are rectangles. Potentially a parallelogram, but it doesn't have to. But rectangles for sure, squares for sure. Perpendicular diagonals, well, the only shape that requires perpendicular diagonals is a rhombus. Parallelograms could have them, but they don't have to, okay? I'm going to do a couple of these. So it says, given the slopes and lengths of each of these sides, A, B, C, D, of parallelogram ABC, D, we have to determine if it's a rhombus, rectangle, parallelogram, square. All right, well, I'm going to start with the most generic and then kind of work my way down. Is it a parallelogram? Well, if it's a parallelogram, you could do two tests looking at the slopes and the lengths. Are the opposite sides parallel? Yes, they are, right? So in this case, these are parallel, so the slopes are the same, and these are parallel, the slopes are the same. So opposite sides are parallel, that's one way to know. And opposite sides are also congruent, so that's nice. So now, do you have to mention both these? No, you just have to do one of the tests, but I thought I'd mention both. Okay, keep going. Rectangle. Is it a rectangle? Well, if it's a rectangle, all the angles are right angles, meaning the slopes need to be opposite reciprocals. They are. So my angles are right angles. And also, you could have checked, instead of checking that, you could have also checked, are my diagonals congruent? These right here are my diagonals, right? AC and BD, those are my diagonals. Are these diagonals congruent? Yes, they are. So that's another test you could have done. All right. Is this a rhombus? Let's check. If it was a rhombus, all of the sides would be congruent. Well, are all the sides congruent? Yes, they are. So it's a rhombus. What else could you have checked? So, oh, I should put all sides, right? All sides congruent. You could have also checked if the diagonals are perpendicular, right? In a rhombus, the diagonal should be perpendicular. 0 and undefined slopes, those are perpendicular. Okay, those are perpendicular. So it is in fact a rhombus, passing both tests. Is it a square? Well, if it's a square, that means that it is a rectangle and a rhombus. Is this in fact a rectangle and a rhombus? Yes, then therefore it is a square. So this is what I'd like you to do. For the rest of these, I want you to go through and do the same tests I just walked through. Is it a parallelogram first? Okay, yes or no. Is it a rectangle? Yes or no. Is it a rhombus? Yes or no. Choose any of the tests you want. You don't have to look at both of these, right? You don't have to look at this and this. Technically, it only has to pass one test for you to know it's for it to be true. So go ahead and do that for 2, 3, and 4. And then we're going to look down here. Are the following quadrilaterals a parallelogram, rectangle, rhombus, or square? All right. these all look very similar, but they have different markings. This parallel, or this quadrilateral, is telling me that all the sides are congruent. If all the sides are congruent, I know it's a rhombus, right? And that's pretty much all I know. Well, if it's a rhombus, then it's also a parallelogram, right? But we don't have to write that. It just says state the most specific one. So that's about it. I'm going to have you guys do that for the rest of these as well. Good luck. At the end of class, make sure that you are turning in. All of these problems should be completed by the end of class. You may absolutely talk to each other. You may ask for help. Rewatch this video. All be done by the end of class. You're turning it into the assignment folder. Have a great weekend.